Who do you say that I am? When I think of myself, I know exactly what you see. Every flaw, every blemish, the scars of my hurts and my mistakes, the things I've done to myself, the things that have been said and done to me, that's who I am. You see a mother, a daughter, a sister, an aunt. You see the scarce shadow of a woman's potential irreversibly wrapped in failure. But then I hear it. That still, small voice. Who told you that? Who told you that you are defined by your mistakes? Who told you that you are ugly and broken? Who told you that you are only measured by what you give others? Who told you that brokenness and frailty are what you carry? Haven't you heard? You are not what everyone says you are. You are who God says you are, and you are His. He says you are fearfully and wonderfully made. He says you are a perfect design, made for a purpose, made for a destiny, and you are never alone. He says He'll never leave you nor forsake you. He goes before you. He goes behind you. He says you are bold. He says you are brilliant. He says you are brave. He says greater is He that is in you. You are a masterpiece, hand-painted by the Master Himself. You are who God says you are.
Christian Bootcamp, a Back to Basics Bible study led by the Reverend Dr. B. Kevin Smalls. Christian Bootcamp is a back to basics approach for faith, supported by biblical studies, theology, doctrine, spiritual formation, and special topics. You are in the right place at the right time. Let's get into formation and begin.
Hello, I'm Preston Boyd.
And I'm Gene Boyd.
And we just want to extend an invitation to you to come to Hope United Methodist Church and utilize our food pantry. We're here on the first Saturday of each month from the hours of 10 a.m. until 2 p.m. If you are in need of food assistance, we ask that you call and make a reservation. Our number is 248-356-4408. Be blessed and have a great day.
Welcome to Christian Bootcamp, a Back to Basics Bible study led by the Reverend Dr. B. Kevin Smalls. Christian Bootcamp is a back to basics approach for faith, supported by biblical studies, theology, doctrine, spiritual formation, and special topics. You are in the right place, at the right time. Let's get into formation and begin.
All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our second installment tonight of Christian Boot Camp. I see we already have a room of 28 people in YouTube, at YouTube Live, and I'm checking on my friends here in Facebook Live, and it looks like we have 13. Grace and peace to all of you. It's good to see you. Couple of things about tonight, just a heads up. I'm going to try to wrap us up in 30 minutes as opposed to an hour because my son has a band concert tonight that starts at 6:45, but I would like to catch as much of it as I possibly can. So I may be leaving a half hour earlier tonight than typical, and I apologize for that, missing our full time together. But I'm kind of on roller skates. And next week and the week following, we're going to start looking at biblical text, biblical language, and we'll be studying Hagar. On next week, we're just going to take a look at her experience, and we're going to look at a very difficult experience with Tamar as well, and her rape and the implications for feminist and womanist thought around those stories. So next week, we'll be looking at Hagar, and we'll just kind of jump right in and look at her experience and see what we can discover and learn. I'm thinking I'm going to try to get in 4 biblical characters to analyze in terms of their experience before we conclude. We will conclude at the end of March, and we will resume sometime later in the summer because, of course, April is Easter. I will be on vacation the latter part of April, and June is annual conference time, and it's a lot going on. So we may be looking at July or June to begin our next conversation, and I haven't quite decided what that is. But what I do want to do is explore some of these social intersections as it relates to our theology, right? And how we believe and why we believe what we believe when it comes to some of the experiences of people. So last month we looked at Black theology in the eyes of James Cone, and we understand that James Cone is just one of several who have contributed to theological discourse as it relates to liberation theology around the subject of Black people. We are now looking at feminist and womanist thought, and we'll see what happens in June, all right? Remember, these classes are not to change minds. I'm not trying to indoctrinate anyone on any particular subject. I'm not trying to twist anybody's arm. This is a presentation of material for us to study. There are times that I will give you some of my own commentary in response to it. But the main thing is we are learning tough and serious and open material. So we don't want to just We don't want to just be comfortable in our faith. We want to hear what other people are saying and what other people are thinking and how that impacts the whole spectrum of Christian thought. So let us pause for God's blessing and we'll jump in. Lord, for this day, we give you thanks. We thank you for Jesus. We thank you for his liberating power. We thank you for this Lenten season where we are challenged to live up to the cross, to take up our cross, and to willingly grow and stretch in a way that we might be faithful to the call to be greater disciples. Be with us now as we continue to explore these concepts. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. So tonight I want to kind of have a conversation with you and introduce you to Dr. Jacqueline Grant. Dr. Jacqueline Grant, who was one of my professors, by the way, in seminary a few years ago. Dr. Jacqueline Grant is a student of Dr. James Cone. He was her professor. And what she does is expands his theology, his black theology, to a consideration of a womanist theology, all right? So let's stick with this systematic development if we can, and that's what I'm going to try to offer tonight, a systematic development, so hopefully you can kind of see how these pieces come together. So some of this is a little bit of a repeat of last week, so if you didn't make last week, that's awesome. So when we speak of feminism, in a Christian context, we are looking at a growing contribution to Christian dialogue and theological dialogue from the 60s and the 70s. Now, we want to be clear that women have fought for their rights since the beginning of time, at least the 1600s. You know, there's documented women advocacy by women. So in the 60s and the 70s, we are looking at, or women have begun to raise the question of how their voice is heard in the context of modern society. Things like equal pay for equal work. Things like their ability to have self-selection as it relates to reproduction issues. Things like violence against women, violent portrayal of women, negative portrayals, of women. Things like domestic violence, and bringing awareness to the struggles of women. So in Roe versus Wade in 1973 was a result of a feminist move in action to make sure a woman has the right to choose as it relates to her own reproductive scenario. So now you are seeing a rollback of some of these feminist and liberating norms as it relates to women, and as it relates to, the constant struggle that is still necessary in terms of equal pay for equal rights, equal opportunities. You're seeing not just the rollback of some of the progress that has been made, but you're also seeing some advancements. I know in the National Football League, they have several coaches now on football teams that are women. And there is a rise of women in the National Football rank. I'm just a fan of the NFL, so I've noticed some of these things. But also, even in the ministry, we're recognizing a more concentrated emergence of women as leaders and pastors that is continuing to grow and expand. But during this time, there were serious questions that had begun to be raised. One is, how do we treat women, and what is the role of women in Christian context and in the church? So there are about three different strands of women that I would like for you to consider. One is the biblical liturgical language strand of feminist. Three different strands of feminism, I should say. The other is the liberation strand, and we spent a lot of conversation on liberation feminism last week. The third is a rejectionist model of feminism, okay? So what you're seeing in the rise in the 60s and 70s is you are seeing some scholars that are coming out with very bold books, very bold pieces of literature. Their suggestion that God has breasts was one, one well-known scholar, and I think I can pull up his name for you. Yes, Paul Jewett, Jewett. Paul Jewett talks about the God who has breasts. And while it has an erotic tone to it, it is nothing erotic at all. It is trying to trace the feminine elements of God. So God is clearly, in some regards for people, in this regard, God is a woman. God is not just father, but God is also mother. God creates, but God also nurtures. God cares for. God is gentle, and God is loving. God is not just the God of the masculine, you see. And so even in Jesus, who comes to break bread and drink wine and broken body and shed blood are the symbols of communion. But they're also what happens when a woman gives birth. Her body is broken, and she does shed blood for the birth of a new being. So we see a God who comes with broken body and shed blood for the redemption and the birth of a new nation. These are some of the thoughts that have begun to circulate in seminaries and universities in the late 60s and all during the 70s. This was beginning to be so powerful, because we're talking about the biblical form of feminism, that now it's kind of weird saying God is male. You know, we're watching our liturgical language now. So it was considered to be harmful to display an all-male God. It was harmful to women to display an all-male God, a male God that might have had insensitivities to the plight of women. So that's one area of focus. How do we use language when we reference God? Because to reference God as male is to bring limitations around such. And there are problems with this theology, don't get me wrong. And I know some of you are already thinking about some of these problems as it stands. I'm just introducing the concepts. So instead of, for years, we were very careful about how we used our theological language in worship as it related to God. So even the benediction, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine radiantly upon you. We stopped saying that. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make the Lord's face to shine radiantly upon you. We neutralize God in the context of gender. And our language, if you will, elevated the identity of divine being beyond gender. Beyond gender. So God makes male and female because according to the Genesis story, God's plan is they need one another, one for another. There are roles for each to have, but somehow in this consideration, everyone has considered the woman to be subservient to the man as opposed to being equal. And it might be because she came later. It might be, because according to the story, the narrative, God took a rib, so this woman doesn't exist on her own. She exists having to borrow parts from the man. So she is almost a byproduct of the man. She's an extension of him. And biblical feminism was the work of reviewing how we saw the role of women in Bible and in liturgy. So that's where you get that. And to this day, I try very hard, to be honest with you, to utilize a gender-neutral language as it relates to God. But it's something that we still struggle with, and it was introduced. So you do have, like when Reverend Grimes was here, he would say Mother God. He would often reference God as mother. And who a mother is and who a father is has different impact and different meaning to different people. For some people, a father was the disciplinarian. For some people, the father was the manager. The father was the go-getter or the breadwinner. Depending on which part of history, we have these identity roles. For some people, the father was the distance one, the one who was not always emotionally available to people. So there are, and in some people, the father was someone that was absent and not present. For some people, the father was unknown. And when we say God is Father, sometimes people hear God as their experience of Father, and as a result of that, they build their faith with a God that they don't consider to be emotionally available. They only see God as a disciplinarian sometimes. They only see God as someone who's not present. Now, a mother, on the other hand, oftentimes, but not always, not in an absolute way, sometimes a mother, interestingly enough, has a more positive identity with people. The mother is the nurturer, the hugger, the consoler, the comforter. The mother is the one that sacrifices. The mother provides the meal, serves the meal in the same way Jesus did at the Last Supper. The mother is the one that would listen and give counsel, and the mother would often defend the child to the father in a larger family. So for years, it was an insult to some people in the church to reference God as mother, because now you are reducing God. You're reducing God and who God is in their eyes. You're making God weak by referencing God as mother. So the imagery threw a whole lot of people off. And they thought it was sacrilegious because it says in the Bible that God is a man. But let me tell you, it doesn't say that as such, does it? Is it possible that God is fatherly? And if God is fatherly, does that not mean that God couldn't also be motherly in a maternal way? Does God not have maternal attributes? Are you sure when we say this? Because God, through Christ, says many things that are rather maternal. I will never leave you. I will send someone to comfort you. Let not your hearts be troubled. You know, these motherly kind of tender moments. Peter, do you love me? Not just once, but 3 times. No, Peter, I need it. Do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Now that's kind of intense emotionally. You can't say you cannot say that Jesus was emotionally unavailable. Jesus was very available emotionally. He wept when he got to Bethany at the Lazarus scene. Jesus wept. For the first time in biblical documentation, God cries. Are we sure that we've explored all these norms that are biblically related to our understanding of who God is and how far God is with us and among us, how far and how near God is in terms of our measurement standards of literature? All right? So these are the issues that have been brought forth by the feminist movement. So there was a branch of feminism that dealt with how the Bible treated women, and there was some really tough things that feminists said about the Bible, and we'll get to that in a moment. So let's just move on to the liberation concept of feminism. So the biblical concepts are that women are created equally. They're not second to men. That's the biblical concept of feminism wanted to arise. That God is not just to be referenced as male, but God is to be considered as gender neutral, which includes God being able to be considered as mother. And there are some to this day that will never reference God as a mother. Only Father. And part of that is because of Jesus' use of the language of Father. And some find that problematic, and we'll get there. Hang in here with me. All right? So now you have a biblical consideration, and we're going to look at these biblical considerations deeper in the last 2 classes. But you also have the liberationist point of view, and we went through that a lot last week. Rosemary Ruther was one of the thinkers in this regard. There's also a writer that I came up with, that I encountered, and I'll give her name to you, Letty Russell, Rosemary Ruther. Letty Russell, Letty, Russell, Russell. They come with the strand of thought that feminism is an exploration of freedom for women to be free as whole persons, for God's desire for women to be free as whole persons. And a lot of this grew out of the modern civil rights movement. So when we're talking about the liberation of black people and the freedom of black people from white oppression, liberationist feminists are seeking freedom from white males and white male oppression and dominance. Feminist is a conversation about freedom from white male dominance. The biblical feminists are looking at the liberation of women from male patriarchal systems and looking at the liberation of women in the Bible from violent, unfair scenarios and unhealthy appropriations for women. That's the biblical job. That's the biblical feminist job. The liberationists are looking at how women can be free in social context. And they utilize the Bible as the inspiration for such freedom. But they definitely want to weigh heavily on, I am free to be who I am. I am free to be liberated from male oppression, male abuse, and male sexual assault. Because to study liberationist feminism is to also study the history of sexual assault, sexual language, and using women as sexual devices. So you can understand that feminism came hard after Playboy. I think Hugh Hefner, was that his name? The founder of that magazine. Feminists were coming hard after any of these entities that were trying to degrade women in how they portrayed women in magazine ads, how they portrayed women everywhere. Women, news anchors, everywhere, there was this push to stop utilizing women as sexual devices. You know, in the Jet magazine, for those of you who remember the Jet, back in the day when we had Jet magazine, I assure you, I promise you, there were many who would get that Jet magazine and do what? I lost my Facebook, folks. I'm trying to get back. There would be many who would get that Jet magazine and go to that centerfold. And they'll have those conversations about, wow, what a looker that was this month or this week. I think Jet came out a little more frequently than once a month. But you had all of these kinds of uses of women and not so much men. It was noted by the feminist women when it came to women in film. Why are the women so exploited in film? You know, why Why is this so? So there was a big movement to raise awareness for this and to liberate women, which the feminist movement considered these things to be the impetus that would often lead to sexual violence. So you remember the experience a couple of years ago with Bill Cosby and exploring that. Feminists would come hard after that kind of behavior because it was another form of oppression and violence toward women. So liberationist feminists certainly spend a lot of time bringing awareness to this. Now, here's where the point is challenged. Nobody said anything about black women yet. No one has talked or extended this conversation of feminism to black women. So far, feminism is considered, this version, a white middle-class response to male patriarchy and dominance. Patriarchy and dominance. All right? It's the white middle-class women response. Nobody talks about the liberation of black women in this regard. Nobody talked about how black women were actually being paid. You're talking about equal pay. Black women were being paid less than white women and white men and black men. Black women were assaulted all the time, but to go deeper, many black women in the days of slavery were owned by white women. So this creates a problem of biblical proportions for black scholars and black feminist scholars. The conversation is, wait a minute, hold it. You all are only talking about yourselves. Nobody has talked about us. So this emergence of black feminism is coined as black womanism. It is womanist thought. And womanist thought tends to isolate itself from white men, white women, and black men. And as a result, form its own voice in this context. It's the black women, and I think I mentioned this last week, who are not coming after men, but black women see their roles as nurturing men. Now, I offered a movie for you all to consider, Nothing But a Man. One of you actually went to see that movie. You secured that movie and you gave me some feedback on it. And you talked about how this woman character loves. There's her father, there's her husband, and there is the husband's child that comes a little later from a prior relationship, and the woman makes room for all of that energy, you see. Let me tell you, black women are aware that black women can't afford to not love their husbands, their brothers, their sons, their fathers, and their grandfathers. White women have a different spin on it. White women can reject men, and those men will be fine. I hope y'all are hearing me. But black women can't afford that because those men won't be fine. And sometimes the only people loving these men to health and wholeness are black women. Now, there's a rejectionist feminism that rejects anything that's male. It also rejects Christ and Jesus because Jesus is male. And God chose to come as a man, and in the fullness of man, there are things that a man can't understand. And so to resolve this issue, white feminists have leaned a little more toward the divinity of Christ. The divinity of Christ, which is certainly not bound by gender. The divinity of Christ, the Christ who walks on the water, the Christ that ascends to heaven post-resurrection. You know, the Christ of miracles, not so much the man that told the Syrophoenician woman that used a metaphor to describe her of dogs. You know, there are feminists that struggle with a male Jesus and a male God. The womanist movement, in the writings of Dr. Jackie Grant, suggests, no, you all have a Christ, but we still have Jesus. Let me tell you. So her book is entitled White Woman's Christ, Black Women's Jesus, a response to white feminist thought. Now we're in some heavy stuff. So black women are coming forward. Now, Dr. Grant, because you got to understand, these writers are really radical. I mean, they are pushing it. If you listen to them, they're radical. James Cone says, almost in a non-reconciling way, James Cone says, you can't even be saved if you, he's this close. If you ain't black, you out of luck. Because Jesus came for black people. And it's documented and clear that Jesus came for black people. So I don't know what you can do if you're not black. And in order to be saved, you have to, at minimum, become the oppressed. Because Jesus came for the oppressed. Jesus didn't come for rich folk. Now that's kind of some James Conean thought. Now you have the feminists who are there drawing their hard line in the sand. Well, God is for the liberation of women. In fact, God ain't just male, God is female too. I know I got to get out of here, but God is female too, right? God is female too. Now, Jackie Grant comes to say that you all can abandon Jesus if you want to, and only solve this and resolve your issues with men by leaning toward a divine Christ. Now, this got really tricky back in the 80s. There was even a group, and Dr. Simpson, you're on this call, I think. There was even a group of United Methodists that was focusing more on the divine Christ, or the Sophia, and less of the male human Christ. Dr. Jackie Grant, however, says absolutely not. In fact, now listen. In fact, Jesus was a black woman. That's how far she goes with this thing. Jesus was definitely a black woman, because there's only some things that a black woman knows that Jesus knew. When he delivered that woman who was about to be stoned, when he goes this far to connect to the woman at the well, when he stops and gives more attention to this woman who has the issue of blood for 12 years? Jesus certainly has women. Before Jesus could even die, what does he say? Mother, behold thy son, behold thy mother, woman, behold thy son. He was woman. Woman, behold thy son. You're not just my mother. You are a whole being. You are a woman, and I see you, and in a few minutes I'm about to die for you. Woman, behold thy son. So as far as Dr. Grant is concerned, the womanist perspective of feminism is the perspective of Jesus getting the picture. Jesus understanding the plight of the oppressed. Jesus having a heart for women who are disregarded, overlooked, abused, and in some cases killed simply because she's a woman, which is what was happening at the stoning of that woman caught in adultery. So she brings a critical analysis to the concept of a white woman's, no, don't water down Jesus' being, his divinity. You can't just have the divinity without the humanity because you don't like men. And you're not able to resolve some of the things with men. The rejectionist model definitely has issues with Paul, like many of us have issues with Paul. But Paul, the suggestion is Paul writes out of extreme bias, and he writes out of a sense of prejudice toward women, and he writes in an uninspired way at times, which means that Paul cannot be resolved. And some cannot resolve the problem of Jesus, so they turn to atheism. This is what happens with rejectionist feminism. But the black woman says, oh, no, Jesus was not anti-woman just because Jesus was male. Jesus was down for us. Jesus looked out for us. Jesus came all the way for us and died for us and liberated us and set us free. All right, my friends, I know I went over my half hour. I get worked up into this thing sometimes. But I hope you can see the formation of these arguments and conversations that have been the scope of feminist and womanist dialogue. I hope I've helped us kind of see some of these things. It's deep stuff, right? And Dr. Grant is still very much alive. She's a Methodist minister. She's an AME. And we have womanist ethics, Dr. Emil Towns, Dr. Katie Cannon, who passed away a few years ago. We have a lot of emerging, Dr. Dolores Williams. If we had more time, I would love for you to just hear some of them, from them, hear their stories, hear how they have journeyed. Angela Davis is definitely a womanist, more in the political realm than the theological and the biblical. But yeah, they're out there. Alice Walker, of course, in the literature realm. Toni Morrison in the literature realm. There are these variations of womanist thought that are there. So quite frankly, I think Sojourner Truth was a womanist. If you want to argue some stuff, ain't I a woman? She claims her identity in the same way that Jesus claims his mama's identity. Woman, behold thy son. But son, behold thy mother. You got it? All right, y'all. Thank y'all. I better get out of here. I appreciate you, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you both in Facebook Live and my Zoom callers. Some of you who've called through Zoom. I love y'all, and I appreciate y'all. Thank y'all so much. Please know you're in my hearts and in my thoughts. Good night, everybody. I appreciate you.
Welcome to Christian Bootcamp, a Back to Basics Bible study led by the Reverend Dr. B. Kevin Smalls. Christian Bootcamp is a back to basics approach for faith, supported by biblical studies, theology, doctrine, spiritual formation, and special topics. You are in the right place, at the right time. Let's get into formation and begin.